What happens when the most ruthless man in the Wyoming Territory slides a staggering $500 bank draft across the table to buy a woman's silence? For Eleanor, a struggling frontier schoolteacher, that money could save her students from a brutal winter. But Silas Thorne didn't just buy her silence that midnight, he accidentally bought his own redemption. Welcome to our channel, your sanctuary for sweeping Western romances that touch the soul. Here, we journey back to the untamed American frontier to explore the unbreakable bonds of family, the fierce protective nature of motherhood, and the raw, beautiful grace of human compassion. Today's story explores a timeless truth. True wealth isn't measured in gold, land, or cattle, but in the courage it takes to strip away our armor and trust another broken soul. It is a powerful reminder that while money can buy a secret, only true empathy can heal a scarred heart. If you believe in second chances and love that defies the odds, pull up a chair, hit that like button, and subscribe to our Frontier family. Leave a comment below with your thoughts, and let's ride into today's tale.
Late August in the Wyoming Territory did not surrender to autumn gracefully. It died a slow, suffocating death, baking the earth until it cracked and leaving a pervasive layer of fine amber grit over everything. Inside the dilapidated one-room schoolhouse on the edge of town, the midnight heat was a physical weight. Eleanor Vance wiped a bead of sweat from her temple, her fingers accidentally leaving a faint smudge of ink across her pale skin. She stared at the ledger on her desk, the numbers blurring together in the dim, flickering light of a single kerosene lamp. The columns of figures were an unrelenting testament to her failure. Winter was coming, carrying with it the promise of brutal, freezing winds, and the schoolhouse roof was little more than rotting wood and desperate prayers. She needed coal. She needed slates. She needed a miracle to keep the greedy hands of the local mining company from foreclosing on the land. Eleanor let out a slow, trembling breath and closed her eyes. The silence of the plains was usually a comfort, a vast and empty blanket that wrapped around her fraying nerves. But tonight, the quiet felt heavy, pregnant with unspoken threats. Then, the silence broke. It wasn't the chaotic clatter of drunken ranch hands riding back from the saloon. It was a deliberate, muffled rhythm, horses, ridden hard but kept to a disciplined trot. Eleanor's eyes snapped open. She immediately reached over and twisted the dial on the kerosene lamp, plunging the small room into absolute darkness. In the lawless expanse of the territory, a woman alone did not advertise her presence to midnight riders. She moved silently across the worn floorboards, the fabric of her faded cotton dress rustling softly against her ankles. Kneeling beneath the front window, she carefully pulled back a fraction of the burlap curtain. The moonlight was brilliant, casting long silver shadows across the dry prairie grass. Two men were stopped near the edge of the schoolyard. Eleanor held her breath, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The first man sat tall in the saddle of a massive midnight black stallion. Even in the shadows, the broad, imposing line of his shoulders and the confident, almost predatory way he held the reins were unmistakable. It was Silas Thorne. Silas was the wealthiest cattle baron in the territory, a man whose vast empire of land and livestock cast a long, intimidating shadow over the entire town. He was a man spoken of in hushed, fearful tones, ruthless, cold, and entirely untouchable. But it was the second man who made Eleanor's blood run cold. He was slumped over a smaller roan horse, his hands bound tightly before him, his clothes torn and stained with dark patches that looked terrifyingly like dried blood. As the man turned his head to spit onto the dirt, the moonlight caught the metallic glint of heavy iron shackles around his wrists. He was a prisoner. More specifically, he was the fugitive who had allegedly robbed the territorial stagecoach 3 days prior, sparking a massive armed manhunt. Why was Silas Thorne, a man who practically owned the local law enforcement, riding in the dead of night with a wanted fugitive? Eleanor watched, paralyzed by a mixture of terror and disbelief, as Silas leaned over and handed the fugitive a heavy leather saddlebag and a gleaming Winchester rifle. The cattle baron pointed toward the jagged silhouette of the western mountains. No words were exchanged, or if they were, the wind swallowed them. The fugitive gave a brief, solemn nod, kicked his spurs into the roan, and vanished into the consuming darkness. Silas remained still for a long moment, watching the horizon. Then, slowly, terrifyingly, he turned his horse. He didn't ride toward town. He rode directly toward the schoolhouse. Eleanor scrambled back from the window, her pulse roaring in her ears. He knows, she thought frantically. He saw the lamp go out. She backed away until her spine hit the edge of her wooden desk. She searched the shadows for something, anything, to defend herself, her fingers desperately gripping the heavy cast-iron base of her inkwell. The heavy thud of boots sounded on the wooden porch, a deliberate, unhurried tread. Each step seemed to echo like a gunshot in the stifling room. The doorknob turned with a sharp metallic click. The door swung open, protesting with a long, agonizing creak. Silas Thorne stood in the threshold, a towering silhouette framed by the pale moonlight. He stepped inside, pulling the door shut behind him with a quiet, definitive thud. The room suddenly felt suffocatingly small. He brought the scent of the wild frontier with him: dust, horse sweat, cold leather, and the faint, sharp tang of expensive tobacco. "You can put the inkwell down, Miss Vance," Silas said. His voice was a deep, gravelly rumble that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. It was completely calm, devoid of any surprise or exertion. Eleanor swallowed hard, forcing her chin up, refusing to let her trembling hands betray her fear. She set the iron inkwell onto the desk with a sharp clatter. "You are trespassing, Mr. Thorne. And you are awake past a respectable hour," Silas countered smoothly. He struck a match against the heel of his boot. The sudden flare of orange flame illuminated his face. It was a ruggedly handsome face, carved by harsh winters and unforgiving sun, dominated by a strong jaw and piercing steel-gray eyes that held absolutely no warmth. He reached over and relit her kerosene lamp, adjusting the wick until a low, steady glow filled the space between them. He didn't look at the window. He didn't check to see what she had witnessed. He already knew. Silas unbuttoned his tailored wool coat, the fabric parting to reveal the silver gleam of a Colt revolver strapped to his hip. He reached into the inner breast pocket of his coat and pulled out a leather-bound checkbook. "I prefer to keep my transactions brief," Silas said, stepping toward her desk. He moved with a quiet, lethal grace that belonged to a much younger, hungrier man. "So, we will skip the part where you pretend you didn't see anything, and the part where I pretend I believe you." "I don't know what you are talking about," Eleanor said, her voice tighter, higher than she intended. "I saw nothing but a man trespassing on school property." Silas didn't smile, but a muscle feathered in his jaw. He pulled a silver fountain pen from his pocket, unscrewed the cap, and laid the checkbook flat over her open ledger. "I admire loyalty, Miss Vance, I really do," Silas murmured, his eyes fixed on the paper as the nib of his pen began to scratch methodically across the surface. "But I have found that a poor memory is much more reliable." Eleanor watched his large, calloused hand form sharp, precise letters. The sheer audacity of the man sent a sudden, hot spike of anger through her chest, temporarily burning away her fear. "You think you can just ride up to my door in the middle of the night, harboring a wanted criminal, and—" "I am not harboring anyone," Silas interrupted seamlessly, his tone remaining terrifyingly level. "As of 5 minutes ago, that man is no longer in my jurisdiction, and as of right now, neither is your opinion." He tore the slip of paper from the book with a sharp tearing sound that made Eleanor flinch. He picked it up between his index and middle finger and extended it toward her. Eleanor didn't move. She stared at the piece of paper as if it were a coiled rattlesnake. "Take it," Silas commanded, the gravel in his voice deepening. Slowly, hesitantly, Eleanor reached out. Her fingertips brushed against the thick, expensive parchment. She pulled it toward the light of the lamp. Her breath hitched in her throat. "Pay to the order of Eleanor Vance. $500. The numbers seemed to swim before her eyes. $500. It was an astronomical sum. It was more money than a territorial schoolteacher would make in 3 years of backbreaking labor. It was a new cedar roof. It was a mountain of coal. It was fresh books, warm blankets for the poorer children, and absolute, undeniable salvation from the mining company. It was, quite literally, a fortune. Eleanor looked up from the paper, her hazel eyes meeting his cold gray stare. The anger in her chest swelled, thickening into a heavy, suffocating knot of pure indignation. "You think," Eleanor started, her voice shaking with rage, "you think you can just buy my conscience?" "I don't care about your conscience, Miss Vance," Silas said flatly. He adjusted the brim of his Stetson, his expression utterly blank. "I care about your silence. Consider it a generous donation to this establishment. Buy a roof that doesn't leak. Buy some decent coal so you don't freeze to death come November. Do whatever it is you do." "It's dirty money," Eleanor whispered fiercely. She moved to shove the bank draft back across the desk. "I won't take it. I will go to the marshal tomorrow morning and tell him exactly which way that man rode." Before she could push the paper back, Silas's hand shot out. His fingers, rough as sandpaper and impossibly strong, wrapped around her wrist. He didn't squeeze, but the sheer immovable weight of his grip froze her in place. The air between them crackled, suddenly thick with a dangerous, unspoken tension. Silas leaned in, his face mere inches from hers. Up close, Eleanor could see the faint silvery scars near his hairline, the shadows of a violent past he wore like a tailored suit. "The marshal works for me, Eleanor," Silas said softly, the use of her first name sending a strange, unsettling shiver down her spine. "The judge works for me. The men who own the bank holding the deed to this school work for me. You go to town tomorrow with a story about a midnight ride, and by noon you will be a raving hysteric who was let go for the safety of the children. By sunset, this school will be boarded up." He released her wrist slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. "I'm not asking for your understanding," Silas continued, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "I am buying your memory. That draft clears at the First National Bank in Cheyenne. Take it, keep your mouth shut, and we will never have to speak of this night again." Eleanor stood frozen, the phantom pressure of his grip still burning on her skin. She looked down at the draft in her hand. The moral compromise tasted like ash in her mouth. She was a woman of principle, a woman who taught her students about honesty, integrity, and the light of truth. But truth couldn't buy coal. Truth wouldn't keep the snow off the children's heads. She hated him. She hated the sheer arrogant certainty in his eyes, the absolute conviction that every person in the world had a price tag attached to their soul. But as she looked around the dark, rotting room, she knew he had won. She carefully folded the bank draft in half and slipped it into the pocket of her apron. Silas watched the movement, a flicker of something unreadable, perhaps triumph, perhaps a cynical disappointment passing through his eyes. He nodded once, a curt, businesslike gesture. "Good night, Miss Vance." He turned and walked out the door, leaving it open to the stifling night air. A moment later, Eleanor heard the heavy creak of leather as he mounted his horse, followed by the fading rhythm of hooves receding into the dark. Eleanor stood alone in the quiet schoolhouse, the weight of the $500 sitting in her pocket like a piece of lead. She had saved the school. She had secured the future of her students. But as she stared out into the vast, empty Wyoming night, Eleanor knew with terrifying certainty that her own life had just been irrevocably sold. And the ruthless cattle baron who bought it hadn't just purchased her silence. He had inadvertently tethered her fate to his own. The agreement was struck, but the real cost was yet to be paid. The sun rose over the Wyoming plains, not with a gentle glow, but with a harsh, blinding glare that seemed to punish the parched earth for its thirst. Eleanor Vance had not slept. She had spent the night sitting at her desk, the $500 bank draft resting beneath the flickering lamp, like a pact with the devil. Every time she looked at it, she felt a wave of nausea, followed immediately by a sharp, pragmatic sting of relief. By 8 in the morning, she was standing in front of the First National Bank. Her dress was pressed, her hair pulled back into a bun so tight it pulled at her scalp, and her jaw was set in a line of pure iron. She cashed the draft without a word, ignoring the teller's widened eyes at the astronomical sum. By noon, she had paid the coal merchant for a full winter's supply and settled the schoolhouse's back taxes. She expected to feel free. Instead, she felt like a bird in a gilded cage. The cage door opened 2 days later in the form of a black-clad rider. It wasn't Silas Thorne, but one of his foremen, a man with a face like cured leather named Miller. "Mr. Thorne requires your presence at the ranch, Miss Vance," Miller said, tipped his hat barely an inch. "He's got a backlog of ledgers that would confuse a saint, and he reckons a schoolteacher's eyes are better suited for the task than his own." "I have a school to run," Eleanor replied, her voice crisp despite the fluttering in her stomach. "School's out for the harvest, ma'am. Most of your students are in the fields," Miller countered. He held out a hand to help her onto the spare horse he had brought. "And Mr. Thorne doesn't much care for the word no when he's already paid for yes." The ride to the Thorne Ranch, the Blackwood, took nearly 2 hours. The scale of the property was staggering. Miles of high-tensile fencing, thousands of head of cattle bearing the T brand, and finally, the house itself. It was a monolith of stone and timber, perched on a rise that overlooked the valley like a fortress. Silas was waiting for her in his study. The room smelled of old paper, expensive whiskey, and the lingering scent of his tobacco. He didn't rise when she entered. He simply pointed to a secondary desk in the corner, piled high with chaotic stacks of receipts, shipping manifests, and payroll sheets. "My previous clerk had a fondness for the bottle and a distaste for accuracy," Silas said, his gray eyes tracking her movement. "Clean it up. I want to know exactly who I owe and who owes me by the end of the week." "Is this part of our arrangement?" Eleanor asked, lingering near the door. "Consider it an extension," he replied, his voice a low rumble. "I bought your silence, Miss Vance. Now I'm hiring your mind. There's a difference." The days that followed were a study in silent warfare. Eleanor worked from dawn until the shadows grew long, her fingers stained with ink and her eyes aching from the cramped handwriting of a dozen different ranch hands. Silas was often in the room with her, buried in his own maps or brooding over the fluctuating price of beef in Chicago. He was a silent, looming presence. He didn't offer small talk, and he didn't offer kindness. He treated her with a clinical, almost cold professionalism. Yet Eleanor found herself watching him. She saw the way his jaw tightened when he read a report of a lost calf. She saw the way he moved, with a slight hidden limp in his left leg that he tried to disguise with a heavy rhythmic gait. One afternoon, as she was reconciling the payroll, she stopped. "You're underpaying the men in the South Camp," she said, her voice cutting through the silence. Silas looked up, his brow furrowing. "They get the standard territorial rate." "The standard rate doesn't account for the fact that they're working 16-hour shifts in the sun without adequate water barrels," Eleanor countered, standing up. "They're men, Mr. Thorne, not mules. If you treat them like the latter, you shouldn't be surprised when they kick." Silas stared at her, his expression unreadable. For a moment, Eleanor thought he might fire her, or worse. Then he looked back down at his maps. "Water barrels are expensive to haul," he muttered. "Not as expensive as replacing a crew that's walked off the job," she retorted. The next morning, Eleanor saw a wagon loaded with fresh cedar barrels heading south. Silas didn't mention it. He didn't thank her. But the air in the study felt a fraction less suffocating. The second week at Blackwood brought a shift in the weather and the mood. A relentless dry wind began to howl off the mountains, rattling the heavy shutters of the manor. Eleanor was deep into the 1876 manifests, the years Silas had first established the ranch. As she cross-referenced the names of the original hands, she found a recurring entry. Company B, 4th Cavalry. She looked at Silas, who was cleaning a rifle at his desk. The lamplight caught the silver of his hair, and the deep lines of weariness etched into his face. "You were with the 4th?" she asked softly. The rhythmic shush-shush of the oilcloth stopped. Silas didn't look up. "A long time ago." "The man you freed that night," Eleanor continued, her heart racing. "He was on these manifests. Caleb Reed. He was your sergeant." Silas set the rifle down with a heavy thud. He finally looked at her, and for the first time, Eleanor didn't see the cold cattle baron. She saw a man staring into a ghost-filled past. "He was the man who pulled me out of a burning thicket at the Washita River," Silas said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "The army called it a victory. We called it a massacre. Caleb wasn't a stagecoach robber, Eleanor. He was a man trying to reclaim a life that the government had chewed up and spat out. He came to me because I was the only one left who knew he wasn't a monster." Eleanor felt a lump form in her throat. The $500 draft in her pocket suddenly felt lighter, though no less complicated. "Why didn't you just tell the law if he was innocent?" Silas let out a short, cynical laugh. "In this territory, innocent is a luxury for people with names like yours. For men like Caleb, men with ghosts and no gold. The law is just a rope looking for a neck. I didn't buy his freedom, Eleanor. I bought him a chance to die in the mountains instead of on a gallows in a town that hates him." He stood up, his limp more pronounced than usual, and walked to the window. The wind lashed against the glass, reflecting the turbulence in his eyes. "You think I'm a cold man," he said, not looking at her. "You think I use my money like a whip. And maybe I do. Because I learned the hard way that if you don't own the land and the men on it will eat you alive." Eleanor walked over to him, stopping just short of touching his arm. The distance between them was no longer just about wealth or secrets. It was about the vast, jagged landscape of human suffering. "Money can save a man's life, Silas," she said, her voice steady and gentle. "I know that now. It saved my school. But it can't fix what's broken inside of you. You're trying to buy peace of mind with bank drafts, but you can't bribe your conscience." Silas turned to her. The intensity of his gaze was overwhelming. He looked at her as if she were a puzzle he couldn't solve, a variable he hadn't accounted for in his ledgers. "And what do you suggest, teacher?" he asked, a trace of his usual sarcasm returning, though it lacked its bite. "Shall we have a lesson on the soul?" "Perhaps," she replied, a small, brave smile touching her lips. "Lesson 1. Every man has a scar, but not every scar has to be a cage." For a long moment they stood there, framed by the dark timber of the room and the howling Wyoming wind. The silence was no longer heavy with threats, but with the fragile, terrifying possibility of understanding. Silas reached out, his hand hovering near her face for a split second before he caught himself. He cleared his throat and stepped back, the mask of the cattle baron sliding back into place. "Finish the manifests, Miss Vance," he said, his voice regaining its gravelly edge. "We have a winter to prepare for." Eleanor nodded and returned to her desk. But as she picked up her pen, she realized her hands were no longer trembling. She wasn't just his clerk anymore, and he wasn't just her benefactor. They were two wounded souls, standing on the edge of a vast, unforgiving frontier, realizing for the first time that they might not have to cross it alone. The golden hue of September brought a deceptive peace to Blackwood. The air turned crisp, smelling of cured hay and the pine forests of the high country. However, beneath the surface of the ranch's orderly operations, a different kind of tension was brewing. Eleanor had settled into a rhythm. Her mornings were spent at the schoolhouse, readying the building for the few children who could be spared from the harvest, and her afternoons were dedicated to Silas's library. The more she worked with the ranch's finances, the more she realized that Silas Thorne's ruthlessness was often a defensive reflex, a way to control a world that had once taken everything from him. The crisis began on a Tuesday. The wind was whipping across the valley, carrying the frantic shouts of men from the north corrals. Eleanor dropped her pen as she saw a wagon racing toward the main house, the horses lathered in white foam. In the back of the wagon lay old Pete, a ranch hand who had been with Silas since the beginning. His leg was crushed, the bone jagged and white against the blood-soaked denim of his trousers. A freak accident with a stampeding stallion had pinned him against a stone wall. Silas was there before the wagon even stopped. His face was a mask of stone, but Eleanor saw the way his fingers twitched as he looked at the man who had served him for a decade. Get him to the bunkhouse, Silas barked. Miller, ride for the doctor in Buffalo. Tell him I'll double his rate if he's here by sunset. 2 hours later, the doctor emerged from the bunkhouse, wiping blood from his hands. He shook his head grimly as he met Silas and Eleanor on the porch. I've stabilized him, Silas, but the leg is useless. He'll never ride again. In fact, he'll be lucky to walk with a crutch. Silas stared at the horizon. I see. He's got no family, the doctor added. Without his wages, he's a ward of the territory. That evening, Eleanor found Silas in his study. He wasn't looking at maps. He was writing a check. He didn't look up when she entered. I've settled it, Silas said, his voice flat. I'm giving Pete $200 and a rail ticket to a convalescent home in St. Louis. It's more than most men in his position get. It'll keep him fed for a year or two. Eleanor felt a cold shiver that had nothing to do with the Wyoming wind. You're throwing him away, Silas. He snapped his head up, his gray eyes flashing. I'm being practical, Eleanor. This is a working ranch. I can't keep a man who can't pull his weight. The bunkhouse is for men who can ride. St. Louis is the kindest thing I can do for him. Kindness? Eleanor stepped closer, her voice vibrating with indignation. You're treating him like a horse with a broken leg. Pete gave you his youth. He gave you his loyalty when you had nothing but a patch of dirt and a few head of cattle. Now that he can't produce a profit for you, you're buying his exit so you don't have to look at the consequence of the life you've built. I am a businessman, not a charity. Silas slammed his hand on the desk. $200 is a fortune to a man like Pete. He doesn't want your fortune, Silas. He wants his dignity. Eleanor slammed her own hand down, refusing to back away. He wants to know that his life meant something more to you than a line in a ledger. A human being is not a tool to be discarded when the edge grows dull. If you send him away, you aren't just losing a ranch hand. You're losing your soul. Silas stood up, looming over her. And what would you have me do? Keep a cripple on the payroll out of sentiment? I would have you treat him with respect, she whispered. He knows the land better than anyone. Let him manage the tack room. Let him teach the younger boys how to mend harness. Give him a reason to wake up in the morning that doesn't involve a rail ticket to a place where he'll die of loneliness. Silas stared at her, his chest heaving. The silence stretched between them, heavy and jagged. For the first time, Silas looked away. He looked at the check on his desk, the paper solution to a human problem. Go to the bunkhouse, Eleanor, he said quietly. Tell Pete. Tell him he stays. And tell Miller to build a ramp for the tack room door. Eleanor felt the tension leave her body in a sudden rush. She looked at Silas, seeing the conflict in his eyes, the slow, painful thawing of a heart that had been frozen for too long. Thank you, Silas. Don't thank me, he muttered, turning back to the window. It's a poor business decision. Perhaps, Eleanor said softly as she reached the door, but it's a magnificent human one. The storm didn't give a warning. It descended from the Bighorn Mountains like a white shroud, a blue norther that dropped the temperature 40 degrees in an hour. It was late October, and Silas had been out at the far north camp when the clouds turned the color of a bruised plum. Eleanor, watching from the schoolhouse, saw the first flakes of snow, dry, hard pellets that hissed against the glass. By the time she reached the Blackwood estate, the world was a howling void of white. He's not back, Miller said, his face grim as he met her at the door. The boss stayed behind to help bring in the strays from the canyon. If they get caught in the draw, the drifts will bury 'em. Eleanor didn't think. She grabbed a heavy wool coat and a lantern. I'm going out. The hell you are, Miss Vance, Miller shouted. I know the trail to the line shack, she yelled over the wind. If he's heading back, he'll stop there. He has a limp, Miller. If his horse trips, he won't make it on foot. The ride was a nightmare of disorientation. The wind screamed, stripping the heat from her bones. Every landmark was erased. She relied on the instinct of her mare, pushing through drifts that reached the horse's chest. Just as she felt the frost beginning to numb her brain, a dark shape loomed out of the white. The line shack. She threw herself off the horse and stumbled toward the door. It swung open before she reached it. A pair of strong, gloved hands caught her, hauling her inside. It was Silas. He was covered in a thick layer of frost, his face blue with cold, but his grip was like iron. He kicked the door shut, barring it against the screaming gale. "Are you insane?" he roared, his breath blooming in the frigid air. "You could have died out there." You weren't back," Eleanor wheezed, her teeth chattering so hard she could barely speak. "I thought... your leg..." Silas stared at her, the anger in his eyes suddenly replaced by something raw and terrifyingly vulnerable. He grabbed a tattered blanket and wrapped it around her, pulling her toward the small stone fireplace where a meager flame was struggling to stay alive. They sat on the floor, huddled together against the cold that seeped through the log walls. The shack was tiny, smelling of damp wood and old hay. Silas wrapped his arms around her, using his own body heat to shield her from the shivering. "I've spent 10 years making sure I never needed anyone," Silas whispered into the darkness, his voice cracked and raw. "I built a wall of gold and stone to keep the world out. And then you walk into my schoolhouse with that ink-stained dress and your talk of dignity." Eleanor looked up at him. His face was inches from hers, illuminated by the dying amber glow of the fire. The ruthlessness was gone. The wealth was gone. There was only a man, stripped of his armor, looking at the one person who had dared to see him. "I didn't want your money, Silas," she whispered. "I just wanted you to see." "I see you, Eleanor," he murmured. "I've seen nothing else since that night." He leaned in, hesitating for a heartbeat, his breath warm against her cold skin. When he finally kissed her, it wasn't the kiss of a cattle baron claiming a prize. It was a desperate, shattering collision of two souls who had been lonely for a lifetime. It was a kiss that tasted of salt, smoke, and the wild, unforgiving Wyoming winter. It was the sound of a $500 agreement shattering into 1,000 useless pieces. In that cramped, freezing shack, the power dynamic that had defined them for months evaporated. He wasn't the man who bought her silence. She wasn't the teacher who was for sale. They were simply Silas and Eleanor, clinging to each other in the heart of a storm, realizing that while money could build a fortress, it could never keep out the cold. Only this terrifying, beautiful connection could do that. When Silas finally pulled back, his forehead rested against hers. "The agreement is over, Eleanor. No more checks. No more silence." "Then what is left?" she asked, her voice trembling. Silas reached out, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with a tenderness that broke her heart. "Everything," he said, "if you're brave enough to stay." The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the shack, for the first time in years, the silence was finally at peace. The morning after the storm brought a silence so profound it felt heavy. The world outside the line shack was buried under 3 feet of pristine, blinding white snow. Inside, the fire had dwindled to gray ash, but the warmth between Silas and Eleanor remained, a fragile new reality that felt more solid than any bank draft. They returned to the Blackwood estate in a slow, rhythmic trudge through the drifts. Silas rode with a grim focus, his jaw set, but every few minutes his eyes would flick back to Eleanor. It wasn't the gaze of a man checking on his property. It was the look of a man who had finally found his North Star and was terrified of losing it. But the peace was short-lived. Standing on the porch of the manor was Sheriff Wade, a man whose badge was as tarnished as his soul. He was leaning against a pillar, picking his teeth with a splinter of wood, his horse shivering nearby. "Thorne," Wade called out, his voice oily. "I didn't think you were the type to get caught out in a dusting of snow, or maybe you were just busy. Entertaining the help?" Silas dismounted, his limp barely visible as he squared his shoulders. "State your business, Wade. I've got cattle to check on." Wade stepped down, his eyes sliding toward Eleanor with a predatory glint. "Funny thing. I was cleaning out the cells after that stagecoach robber escaped, and I found a piece of leather. Had a T brand on it. Seems your gear has a habit of showing up where criminals are found." Eleanor felt her heart skip. This was the moment they had both feared. The secret Silas had paid $500 to bury was clawing its way out of the frozen earth. Wade walked closer, lowering his voice. Now, I figure a man of your standing wouldn't want the territorial marshals sniffing around. It would be a shame if Miss Vance here had to testify about what she saw that night at the schoolhouse. I reckon $5,000 would make that piece of leather disappear. Otherwise, maybe the schoolhouse isn't the only thing that's going to get boarded up. Silas's hand went instinctively to his pocket. The habit of a decade, buying his way out of trouble, was a powerful reflex. He looked at Eleanor, his eyes filled with a desperate, silent apology. He was ready to pay. He was ready to write the check to keep her safe, to keep her name out of the filth. But Eleanor stepped forward, her voice ringing clear in the cold morning air. "No." Both men turned to her. "Don't do it, Silas," she said, her hazel eyes fixed on his. "If you pay him, he'll own us forever. He'll keep coming back until there's nothing left of Blackwood and nothing left of who we are." "Miss Vance," Wade sneered, "you're playing a dangerous game. You could hang for harboring a fugitive." "Then we will hang for doing what was right," Eleanor countered, her chin high. "Go ahead, Sheriff. Call the marshals. Tell them Silas Thorne saved a man's life because the law was too crooked to see the truth. I'll tell them exactly what I saw, including the way you've been extorting this town for years." Silas looked at her, and the conflict in his eyes slowly turned into a fierce, burning pride. He pulled his hand away from his pocket. He didn't reach for his money. Instead, he reached for Eleanor's hand, lacing his fingers with hers. "Get off my land, Wade," Silas said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "The next time you come here, you'd better bring the marshals. And you'd better be prepared to explain why you're treading on a man who has nothing left to hide." Wade's face turned a mottled purple. He spat on the ground, mounted his horse, and hissed, "You just signed your own death warrants, both of you." As the sheriff rode away, the weight of the decision settled over them. They were no longer protected by the fortress of Silas's wealth. They had chosen the truth, and in the Wyoming Territory of 1878, the truth was often a death sentence. The fallout was swifter than the blizzard. Within 48 hours, the rumors had spread through town like a prairie fire. The wealthy cowboy was now a traitor, and the pious teacher was his accomplice. The shops in town refused to sell to the Blackwood Ranch. The bank frozen Silas's accounts pending an investigation. Even the parents of Eleanor's students stopped sending their children to the schoolhouse, fearing the scandal would rub off on their families. By the end of the week, Silas and Eleanor were effectively under siege. The ranch hands, sensing the shift in power, began to desert. Only Miller and old Pete remained. "They think they can starve us out," Silas said one evening as they sat in the kitchen of the manor. The grand dining room felt too cold, too empty. They were eating a simple meal of beans and salted pork, the same fare the men in the camps ate. "Let them try," Eleanor said, though her hands trembled as she held her fork. Without the buffer of money, the reality of frontier life became a grinding, daily struggle. The winter was relentless. They spent their days cutting wood until their muscles screamed and hauling water from the frozen creek. Silas, deprived of his fine horses and imported whiskey, worked alongside Miller and Pete, his hands becoming calloused and bloodied. One morning, the well froze solid. Silas and Eleanor spent 4 hours in the biting wind, hacking at the ice. When they finally broke through, Silas slipped on the rim, his bad leg giving way. He went down hard, his face contorting in pain. Eleanor was by his side in an instant, her hands frantic as she checked his leg. "Silas, talk to me!" He gritted his teeth, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "It's fine, Eleanor, just the old ghost acting up." "It's not fine," she whispered, pulling his head into her lap. He looked up at her, the sweat freezing on his brow. For the first time, he didn't look like a cattle baron. He looked like the soldier he had been, tired, hurt, and weary of the fight. "I'm sorry," he murmured. "I brought you into this. I promised you a roof that didn't leak, and now I can't even give you a warm house." "You gave me something better, Silas," she said, leaning down to press her forehead against his. "You gave me the truth. You gave me a man who was brave enough to stop hiding behind his gold. I'd rather be cold with you than warm in a house built on lies." In that moment, the hierarchy that had once defined them, the boss and the clerk, the buyer and the bought, was gone forever. They were just two people, stripped of everything but their shared resolve. They began to find a rhythm in the hardship. Eleanor learned to handle a rifle to protect the dwindling herd from wolves. Silas learned to cook over an open hearth when the coal ran low. They found a strange, fierce joy in the struggle. The equality they had talked about in the study was no longer a theory. It was a survival tactic. They were no longer the wealthy cowboy and the teacher. They were partners. One night, as a fresh gale rattled the windows, Silas pulled a small, worn book from his pocket. It wasn't a ledger. It was a book of poetry Eleanor had left in the study weeks ago. "I never understood why people read this," Silas said, his voice soft in the firelight. "But when I was out there today thinking about what Wade might do, I kept thinking about that line you marked, about the unconquerable soul." He looked at her, and the steel gray of his eyes was lit with a new kind of light. "I used to think my money was my strength. I was wrong. My strength was the fact that I survived the Washita. And my strength is the fact that you're still standing here." He reached out and traced the line of her cheek, his touch no longer hesitant. "We're going to lose the ranch, Eleanor. The bank will take the land. Wade will make sure of it." "Let them take it," Eleanor said, placing her hand over his. "The land isn't what makes this home. We can go west. We can start over in Oregon or California. We've got our lives, Silas. And we've got each other." Silas smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached his eyes. "I reckon I've still got $500 in gold buried under the floorboards of the line shack, my rainy day fund." Eleanor laughed, the sound bright and defiant against the howling wind. "Then I suppose we aren't quite as poor as the sheriff thinks." They sat together by the fire, two people who had lost an empire but found their humanity. The storm outside was far from over, but for the first time in his life, Silas Thorne didn't feel the need to buy a shelter. He was already home. The morning of the foreclosure arrived with a bitter, biting chill that seemed to seep straight through the timber walls of the Blackwood Manor. The sky above the Wyoming Territory was a pale, bruised violet, offering no warmth, only the promise of more snow. Inside the great house, the silence was different than it had been months ago. It was no longer the oppressive, echoing quiet of a lonely cattle baron. It was the solemn, steady silence of two people who had made their peace with the end. Eleanor Vance stood by the heavy oak dining table, carefully wrapping a few cast-iron skillets in heavy canvas. She wore her faded wool dress, her hands rough and calloused from weeks of hauling water and chopping wood. Across the room, Silas Thorne was methodically packing a leather saddlebag. He didn't pack the imported cigars, the fine silver, or the tailored suits that had once defined his existence. He packed hardtack, wool blankets, a sturdy hunting knife, and a medical kit. He paused, his fingers brushing against the heavy brass lock of his old lockbox. He opened it, revealing the stack of property deeds that represented a decade of ruthless ambition. Slowly, deliberately, Silas closed the lid and left the box on the desk. "We travel light," Silas murmured, his gravelly voice breaking the quiet. He looked up, his steel-gray eyes finding Eleanor across the room. "The pass through the Bighorns will be choked with snow. We can't afford to carry anything we don't need to survive." Eleanor nodded, tying a knot in the canvas. "I don't need any of this, Silas. I never did." He limped toward her, the old cavalry injury aching in the damp cold. When he reached her, he reached out, his rough, scarred hands gently cupping her face. He looked at her not with the arrogance of a man who owned the world, but with the quiet reverence of a man who had finally found something worth keeping. "I promised you a life, Eleanor," he said softly, a trace of regret shadowing his words. "And all I've given you is a target on your back and a long ride into the freezing mountains." "You gave me back my faith in people," she corrected, leaning into his touch. finding warmth in his calloused palms. "You proved that a man's soul isn't bound by the mistakes of his past. I will ride into those mountains with you, Silas Thorne, and I won't look back once." The tender moment was shattered by the heavy, chaotic thunder of approaching horses. The sound wasn't the disciplined trot of ranch hands. It was the chaotic, arrogant gallop of men who believed they owned the ground they rode upon. Silas's jaw tightened. He dropped his hands from Eleanor's face and instinctively reached for the Winchester rifle leaning against the doorframe. "Stay behind me," he commanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous, absolute calm. Silas pushed open the heavy front doors and stepped out onto the frost-covered porch. Eleanor stood firmly in the doorway, refusing to hide, her chin raised in defiance. Sheriff Wade rode at the front of a dozen armed deputies, their horses tearing up the snow-covered lawn that led to the manor. Wade pulled his horse to a brutal halt, grinning around a chewed cigar. He looked at the packed saddlebags resting near the porch, his eyes gleaming with malicious triumph. "Well now," Wade called out, his voice carrying over the whistling wind. "Look at the great Silas Thorne, reduced to packing his own bags like a common drifter. I told you this day was coming, Thorne. The bank officially foreclosed at dawn. This land, this house, the cattle, it all belongs to the territory now." Silas didn't raise his rifle, but he held it with a casual, lethal readiness. "You have the paperwork, Wade, or are you just here to steal whatever isn't nailed down before the bank assessors arrive?" Wade's face darkened, the oily smile slipping into a sneer. He pulled a rolled piece of parchment from his coat and shook it in the air. "I've got the eviction order signed by the territorial judge, and I've got an arrest warrant, too, aiding and abetting a known fugitive. I figured I'd let you pack before I slapped the irons on you." He pointed a thick, gloved finger at Eleanor. "And the teacher, too. Conspiracy to obstruct justice. You're both going to rot in a cell until the circuit judge comes through in the spring." Eleanor felt a cold spike of fear, not for herself, but for Silas. A man like Silas, a wild, proud creature of the plains, would not survive a winter chained in a damp, freezing cell. She looked at him, preparing to tell him to run, to take the horse and leave her behind. But Silas didn't move. He stood tall, his broad shoulders blocking the wind, projecting an aura of absolute terrifying stillness. "You aren't taking her anywhere, Wade," Silas said, his voice deadly quiet. "You want to take me? Try it. But if any of your men take one step toward this porch, I promise you, Sheriff, you will be the first man to hit the dirt." The deputies shifted nervously in their saddles. They knew Silas Thorne's reputation. They knew the scars he carried from the Washita River. Even stripped of his wealth, the man was a predator. Wade drew his revolver, cocking the hammer with a sharp, metallic click. "I was hoping you'd say that. Resisting arrest makes my job a whole lot easier." He raised the gun. Eleanor screamed Silas's name. But before Wade could pull the trigger, a single deafening gunshot echoed across the valley. It didn't come from Silas. It came from the ridge to the east. Everyone froze. Wade lowered his gun, his head snapping toward the sound. Over the crest of the snow-covered ridge, a new group of riders appeared. They didn't ride like the ragged, corrupt deputies. They rode in a tight, disciplined formation, their dark dusters billowing in the wind. At the front of the column rode a man with a silver star pinned to his chest that caught the weak morning light. It was the unmistakable badge of a United States federal marshal. But it was the man riding beside the marshal that made the breath catch in Eleanor's throat. He was older, his face weathered and lined with hardship, but he sat straight in the saddle. He wore a heavy wool coat, and he held the reins with a quiet, dignified confidence. It was Caleb Reed, the fugitive, the cavalry brother Silas had saved. The column descended the ridge at a rapid trot, quickly surrounding Wade and his panicked deputies. The federal marshal, a stern, broad-chested man with a thick gray mustache, pulled his horse to a stop between Wade and the porch. "Lower that weapon, Sheriff Wade," the marshal barked, his voice booming with undeniable authority. "Lower it now, or my deputies will cut you down where you sit." Wade hesitated, looking frantically at the heavily armed federal men surrounding him. Slowly, trembling with sudden terror, He uncocked his revolver and dropped it into the snow. "Marshal Sterling, I don't know what you're doing here. This is local jurisdiction. I have a warrant for Silas Thorne." "Your warrants aren't worth the paper they're printed on, Wade," Marshal Sterling interrupted smoothly. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a thick, leather-bound ledger. "Not after what Mr. Reed here brought to our office in Cheyenne." Silas lowered his Winchester, his gray eyes fixed on his old sergeant. "Caleb." Caleb Reed tipped his hat, a weary but genuine smile breaking across his weathered face. "Captain Thorne, I apologize for the delay. The weather over the pass was miserable. But you gave me the head start I needed." Marshal Sterling held up the ledger. "Mr. Reed spent the last 2 months tracking down the fences and black market buyers who have been moving the stolen gold from the territorial stagecoaches. Turns out, the man organizing the robberies, forging the manifests, and framing innocent drifters like Caleb Reed was you, Wade." Wade's face drained of all color, turning a sickly, ashen gray. "That's a lie. He's a convicted outlaw. You're going to take the word of a fugitive over a man of the law?" "We took the word of the federal bank examiner who matched your handwriting to the forged shipping manifests, Wade," the marshal countered coldly. "And we took the word of the 3 deputies you fired last year who came forward to testify against you. You're done." Sterling gestured to his men. "Cuff him! Cuff all of them who don't drop their weapons." The deputies immediately threw their rifles into the snow, raising their hands in surrender. Wade was dragged from his horse, screaming and cursing as heavy iron shackles were clamped around his wrists. Eleanor watched in stunned silence as the corrupt sheriff was hauled away. The immediate, suffocating threat of prison, of losing the ranch, of losing Silas, it vanished like smoke in the winter wind. Marshal Sterling dismounted and walked up to the porch, extending a hand to Silas. "Mr. Thorne, the territorial governor sends his apologies. The bank foreclosure has been halted, and your accounts in Cheyenne have been unfrozen. Your property remains yours." Silas shook the marshal's hand, his expression unreadable. "Thank you, Marshal." Caleb walked up the steps, his boots thudding softly against the wood. He stopped in front of Silas, the 2 men sharing a long, silent look that spoke of battlefields, blood, and a brotherhood that transcended time. "I couldn't have done it without the horse, Silas," Caleb said quietly. "Or the rifle. You saved my life. Again." "You cleared your own name, Caleb," Silas replied, his voice thick with emotion. He reached out and pulled his old friend into a brief, fierce embrace. "Welcome home, Sergeant." Caleb stepped back and tipped his hat to Eleanor. "And you must be the schoolteacher. Silas told me about you before I rode out that night. He said you were the bravest woman he'd ever met." I see he wasn't exaggerating. Eleanor felt a blush warm her freezing cheeks. "I am just glad you are safe, Mr. Reed." By noon, the federal marshals had cleared out, taking Wade and his corrupt deputies back to Cheyenne to face federal trial. Caleb had gone down to the bunkhouse to rest, leaving Silas and Eleanor alone on the porch. The sprawling Blackwood estate was quiet once more. The massive herds of cattle dotted the distant hills, and the grand stone manor stood tall against the wind. It was all his again. The wealth, the power, the untouchable status. The wealthy cowboy had his empire restored. But as Silas looked out over the vast expanse of his land, Eleanor saw no triumph in his eyes. There was only a quiet, heavy contemplation. He turned away from the horizon and walked slowly into the house, leaving the front doors open. Eleanor followed him into the study. Silas walked past the grand fireplace and went straight to his heavy mahogany desk. He sat down, pulled out his checkbook, and unscrewed the cap of his silver fountain pen. "What are you doing?" Eleanor asked softly, stepping into the room. "The marshal said your accounts are unfrozen. You don't have to write any more drafts to survive." Silas didn't look up immediately. The pen scratched against the paper, filling out numbers with a rapid, decisive energy. When he finally stopped, he blotted the ink and looked at her. "When Wade was standing on that porch," Silas began, his voice low and thoughtful, "when he told me he was taking everything, the land, the money, the cattle, I realized something. He stood up and walked around the desk, stopping just inches from her. I realized I didn't care, Silas whispered. I looked at all of this, the stone, the gold, the power, and I felt absolutely nothing. The only time I felt fear today was when he pointed his gun at you. He reached out and took her hand, his thumb gently stroking her knuckles. I spent my whole life building a fortress of money to protect myself from the world, Silas continued, his eyes searching hers with a desperate, beautiful honesty. But this winter, when we were freezing in the dark, when we were hauling our own water and eating salted pork, I was happier than I have ever been. Because I wasn't alone. Because I wasn't a master. And I wasn't an owner. I was just a man. Your man. Eleanor's breath hitched, a tear escaping the corner of her eye. Silas. The money is a cage, Eleanor, he said, turning his head to look at the paperwork on the desk. It makes people look at me and see a bank vault. It made me look at my men and see livestock. I won't go back to that. I refuse to. He picked up the stack of papers he had just signed and handed them to her. Eleanor looked down at the documents. They were legal trusts, drawn up on the spot. Silas, this is... She gasped, her eyes widening as she read the figures. I am liquidating 70% of my personal assets, Silas stated firmly. The first trust is a permanent relief fund for the ranch hands. It guarantees pensions for injured men like old Pete. It guarantees fair wages and safe conditions. They will no longer be day laborers. They will have a stake in the profits of Blackwood. Eleanor looked at the second piece of paper, her tears finally spilling over. The second trust is for the town, Silas continued, his voice softening. It is an endowment. It is enough money to tear down that rotting one-room shack and build a proper brick schoolhouse with real glass windows, with enough coal to keep the children warm through the worst blizzards, and a permanent salary for the best headmistress in the territory. He gently took the papers from her shaking hands and tossed them onto the desk. I am not giving it away to buy my conscience, Eleanor, he whispered, stepping close and wrapping his arms around her waist. I am giving it away because it doesn't belong to me anymore. I don't want to be the wealthy cowboy who bought your silence. I just want to be the man who earned your respect. Eleanor threw her arms around his neck, burying her face in his shoulder. The last remnants of the cold, ruthless cattle baron melted away in her embrace. You already have my respect, Silas, she sobbed softly against his coat. You've had my heart since the night in the blizzard. Silas closed his eyes, burying his face in her hair, breathing in the scent of her skin. The heavy burden he had carried since the war, the armor he had worn for a decade, finally fell away. Outside, the harsh Wyoming wind continued to blow across the plains. The land was unforgiving. It waited for no one. It would freeze again. It would burn again. And it would demand blood and sweat from anyone brave enough to walk its trails. But inside the study, the storm was over. Silas Thorne had lost his fortune. But as he held the woman he loved, he knew with absolute certainty that he was finally, truly rich. The $500 agreement was dead, buried under the snows of a bitter winter, and in its place stood a redemption forged in the fires of true, unyielding humanity. The brutal Wyoming winter did not surrender easily, but by late April the icy grip finally broke. The deep snowpack transformed into rushing, muddy creeks, and the hard white plains softened into vibrant patches of green. It was the season of the thaw, a time of rebirth for the land. But inside the Blackwood Manor, the air was heavy with an unexpected absence. Eleanor Vance was gone. Silas Thorne stood in the center of the grand study, the morning sun casting long golden beams across the mahogany floorboards. In his hand, he held a single, neatly folded piece of paper. It wasn't a ledger. It wasn't a bank draft. It was a letter, written in the elegant, precise handwriting he had spent months watching glide across his ledgers. Silas, When I stood on the porch yesterday and watched you give away your empire, I saw the man I have always believed you could be. You are brave, you are honorable, and you have finally set yourself free from the ghosts that haunted this land. But you gave up that world in the heat of battle. You made a grand, sweeping gesture of redemption, and while my heart swells with pride, it also trembles with a quiet fear. I refuse to be your prize. I refuse to be the reward you claim for finally doing the right thing. Our relationship began with a transaction. It was born in debt, forged in a power imbalance, and tested by a storm. I love you, Silas. I love you with a depth that terrifies me. But if we are to build a life together, it cannot be built on the foundation of the Blackwood Manor, surrounded by the echoes of what you used to be. It cannot be out of gratitude, and it cannot be out of obligation. You need time to discover who Silas Thorne is without his fortune. And I need to know that when you look at me, you don't see a woman you saved, but a woman who stands beside you as an absolute equal. I have taken the morning stagecoach to the Valley settlement near Sheridan. Do not follow me with a posse. Do not ride after me to drag me back. If you come, come only when you are certain. Come only as a man, yours in truth, Eleanor. Silas slowly lowered the letter. His chest tightened, a hollow ache spreading beneath his ribs. The old Silas, the wealthy cattle baron, would have been furious. He would have saddled his fastest horse, gathered his men, and ridden her down. He would have demanded her return, using his overwhelming presence to bend the world back to his will. But the wealthy cowboy was dead. Silas walked to the window and looked out over the vast, greening valley. The ranch hands were already at work, their voices carrying over the wind, laughing as they repaired the winter damage. They were free men now, partners in the land. And Silas realized, with a profound, humbling clarity, that Eleanor was right. He had spent his entire adult life defining himself by what he owned. Without his money, without his title, who was he? Did he even know how to love a woman without trying to manage her like an asset? He did not ride after her that day, nor the next. For 3 weeks, Silas stayed at Blackwood. He worked the soil alongside Miller and Caleb. He repaired fences until his hands bled, and he sat by the fire at night, reading the books Eleanor had left behind. He let the silence of the empty manor wash over him, stripping away the last remnants of his arrogance. He learned the quiet, profound difference between being alone and being lonely. He missed her fiercely, not as a possession, but as the other half of his soul. On the morning of the 21st day, the prairie was blanketed in a sea of wild, purple crocus flowers. Silas woke before the dawn. He didn't put on his tailored wool coat or his silver-spurred boots. He wore faded denim, a worn cotton shirt, and his old cavalry hat. He walked down to the stables and saddled his roan horse. He didn't take a rifle. He didn't take a saddlebag full of gold. As he rode out of the Blackwood gates, Caleb Reed stood by the corral, leaning against the wooden rails. "Going somewhere, Captain?" Caleb asked, a knowing smile playing on his lips. "I have an appointment in Sheridan," Silas replied, his voice calm, steady, and completely devoid of its old, commanding gravel. "Take care of the place, Caleb. It belongs to all of you now." The ride to the Valley settlement was long, the muddy trails slowing his horse to a methodical walk. But Silas didn't rush. He listened to the red-tailed hawks crying in the pale blue sky. He felt the warmth of the spring sun soaking into his shoulders. For the first time since the war, his mind was completely quiet. There were no ledgers to balance, no enemies to outmaneuver. There was only the road, and the woman waiting at the end of it. He reached the outskirts of Sheridan by late afternoon. It was a modest settlement, built on the edge of a rushing river, smelling of freshly sawn lumber and wood smoke. He asked a local blacksmith if a school teacher named Vance had passed through. The man pointed him toward a small whitewashed boarding house on the edge of town near a field of tall prairie grass. Silas dismounted at the edge of the field. He tied his horse to a post and began to walk. The wind rippled through the grass, carrying the sweet scent of the blooming wildflowers. He saw her from a distance. Eleanor was sitting on a wooden bench beneath the shade of a massive cottonwood tree. She was reading a book, the afternoon light catching the auburn highlights in her hair. She looked peaceful. She looked radiant. She looked entirely free. Silas stopped a few yards away. He suddenly felt a surge of terrifying vulnerability. He was just a man with a limp and a scarred past. He had no empire to offer her. He knelt down in the dirt, his rough fingers carefully plucking a small cluster of wild purple crocuses from the earth. He stood up, took a deep breath, and walked toward her. The crunch of his boots on the dry grass made Eleanor look up. She froze. The book slipped from her lap, landing softly in the dirt. Her hazel eyes widened as she took in the sight of him. He wasn't the imposing, terrifying figure who had kicked her schoolhouse door open in the dead of night. He looked tired, weathered, and incredibly handsome in his simplicity. Silas stopped in front of her. He didn't speak immediately. He took off his hat, holding it against his chest. "You didn't bring your checkbook," Eleanor whispered, her voice trembling slightly, her eyes brimming with sudden, unshed tears. "I left it behind," Silas said softly, "along with everything else that didn't matter." He extended his hand, offering her the fragile, crushed bouquet of wildflowers. It was a clumsy, deeply vulnerable gesture. "I spent 3 weeks trying to figure out who I am without the Blackwood brand behind my name," Silas began, his voice rough with emotion. "And the only answer I could find is that I am a man who loves you. I don't have a fortune anymore, Eleanor. I have a piece of land, a house that is too quiet, and a heart that doesn't beat right when you aren't near it." Eleanor slowly stood up. She didn't look at the flowers. She looked straight into his steel-gray eyes, searching for any lingering trace of the ruthless cattle baron. She found only pure, unadulterated devotion. "I didn't come to buy you back," Silas continued, taking a slow step closer. "I came to ask you, as a free man, asking a free woman, will you come home? Not to my ranch, to our home. Will you let me spend the rest of my life earning the right to stand beside you?" A brilliant, tearful smile broke across Eleanor's face. She didn't take the flowers. Instead, she stepped into his space, reaching up to frame his rugged, scarred face with both of her hands. "I thought you would never ask, Silas Thorne," she whispered. When he kissed her under the shade of the cottonwood tree, there were no storms, no threats, and no shadows of the past. It was a kiss of profound, enduring peace. The journey was over. The wealthy cowboy was gone, but the man who remained had finally found his true frontier. 14 months later, the town of Buffalo, Wyoming, bore little resemblance to the frightened, corrupt settlement it had once been. The dirt streets were graded, new businesses were thriving under the protection of honest federal law, and the fear that had once choked the valley had evaporated like morning mist. But the jewel of the town sat upon the small hill overlooking the valley. It was a beautiful, sturdy schoolhouse constructed of deep red brick, boasting large glass windows that caught the morning light, and a heavy slate roof that no winter blizzard could ever breach. Inside the classroom, the air smelled of lemon oil, fresh chalk, and the sweet scent of dried lavender. It was Saturday, and the desks had been carefully pushed to the walls to make room for the crowd. The entire town had gathered. They weren't there for a lesson. They were there for a wedding. Eleanor stood at the back of the room, smoothing the skirt of her dress. It wasn't silk or imported lace. It was a beautiful, simple gown of ivory cotton, embroidered with small wild vines along the hem. She wore no veil, only a crown of braided prairie grass and purple crocuses resting in her hair. Through the open doors, she could hear the lively tuning of a fiddle and the low, joyous murmur of the guests. Caleb Reed was there, wearing a new suit, laughing with the local blacksmith. Miller and old Pete, leaning comfortably on his carved wooden crutch, were arguing good-naturedly with the town's new, honorable sheriff. They were a community forged in the fires of hardship, bound together by mutual respect. As the fiddle began to play a slow, sweet melody, Eleanor stepped into the aisle. At the front of the room, standing beneath an archway woven from cedar branches, was Silas. He wore a dark, impeccably clean suit, but the harsh, untouchable aura of his past was entirely absent. As he watched her walk down the aisle, his gray eyes were bright with an emotion so powerful it made his chest ache. He didn't look like a man claiming a victory. He looked like a man who had been granted grace. When Eleanor reached him, Silas took her hands in his. His calluses were still there, rough and familiar, a testament to the honest labor he now poured into the earth. The ceremony was brief and stripped of grand pretense. They spoke their vows in clear, steady voices, promising not just love and honor, but partnership, equality, and a shared dedication to the people around them. When the preacher finally smiled and said, "You may kiss the bride," Silas didn't hesitate. He pulled her close, kissing her with the same raw, breathless reverence he had shown her in the freezing line shack a year ago. The room erupted in cheers, the sound echoing off the solid brick walls. Later that afternoon, as the town celebrated outside with roasted beef and dancing on the green, Eleanor and Silas stole a quiet moment alone inside the empty schoolhouse. The late afternoon sun streamed through the large glass windows, casting a warm, honey-colored glow over the polished wooden floors. Silas walked up behind Eleanor, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. They stood in comfortable silence, looking at the wall behind the teacher's heavy oak desk. Hanging proudly in the center of the wall, framed in simple dark wood, was a slip of paper. It was yellowed, the ink slightly faded, but the bold, aggressive handwriting was still legible. Pay to the order of Eleanor Vance. $500. Across the center of the draft, written in thick black ink, was a single word. Void. "Every time I look at it," Silas murmured, his deep voice vibrating against her back, "I am reminded of exactly how foolish a man can be when he thinks he can assign a value to a human soul." Eleanor leaned back against his chest, her hands resting over his. "I look at it, and I see the exact moment my life began. It wasn't the money, Silas. It was the fact that you walked into the dark, expecting a frightened girl, and found a woman who refused to bend. It was the beginning of us." Silas turned her around gently, gazing down into her eyes. "I used to believe that this land only respected money and violence. I thought if you didn't own the earth, it would bury you." He reached up, tucking a stray curl behind her ear. "But the land remembers, Eleanor," he said softly. "It doesn't remember the bank accounts. It doesn't remember the titles or the men who tried to conquer it with iron and blood. It remembers the hands that tended it. It remembers the people who planted the seeds and the people who stayed through the storm." He looked around the beautiful, sturdy classroom, a sanctuary of learning built from the ashes of his former greed. "We built something here that the wind can't tear down. We built a legacy." "We did," Eleanor agreed, a profound sense of peace settling over her heart. They walked out of the schoolhouse together, hand in hand, stepping out into the golden light of the Wyoming evening. Below them, the valleys stretched out, vast and eternal. The laughter of the children, the music of the fiddle, and the quiet strength of the community rose up to meet them. The wealthy cowboy had bought her silence for $500, hoping to bury a secret. But instead, the transaction had unearthed a love so powerful it shattered his empire, healed his scars, and rebuilt a broken world. The agreement was long gone, but the truth remained, carved into the very soul of the frontier. Wealth is merely paper, but humanity forged in truth and bound by love is the only treasure that endures. This literary work is intended purely as fiction. Any similarities to real individuals or events are coincidental and arise solely from the nature of storytelling. The author does not claim accuracy regarding real-world details and does not intend to portray real-life circumstances.
Welcome, friends. For over 30 years, I've been spinning tales of the American frontier. I've written about gunfights, cattle drives, and outlaws. But the truth is, the most dangerous frontier we ever cross isn't the physical landscape of the West. It's the rugged, often frozen territory of the human heart. When we look at the story of Silas Thorne and Eleanor Vance in The Wealthy Cowboy Bought Her Silence, it's easy to see a classic clash of wills. On one side, we have Silas, a man who owns the horizon. On the other, Eleanor, a school teacher who barely owns the shoes on her feet. But look closer, and you'll find a profound lesson about the illusion of wealth and the undeniable power of human dignity. Silas's wealth was never really about greed. For him, money was a shield. After surviving the horrors of the Washita River Massacre, he learned a tragic lesson. The world is cruel, the law is flawed, and the only way to survive is to own everything around you. When he slid that $500 across Eleanor's desk, he wasn't just buying her silence. He was desperately trying to maintain control over a world that had once broken him. The first moral lesson of our story is that walls built to protect us often become our prisons. Silas's money kept him safe, but it also kept him entirely alone. He viewed his men as tools and his ledgers as his only companions. He was the wealthiest man in Wyoming, yet his soul was starving. Enter Eleanor. She represents the unshakable moral compass of the story. Eleanor teaches us the second great lesson. Humanity is not a transaction. When old Pete was injured, Silas saw a broken tool and offered a check. Eleanor saw a human being and demanded respect. She taught Silas, and reminds us all, that a person's value is not determined by their physical utility or their bank account. Equality isn't about having the same amount of money. It is about recognizing the inherent. The turning point arrives not with a shootout, but with a blizzard. Nature is the great equalizer. In that freezing-line shack, Silas's gold couldn't start a fire, and his land deeds couldn't keep Eleanor warm. Stripped of his empire, they were just a man and a woman keeping each other alive. That is the ultimate message I wanted to convey in this tale. True redemption requires vulnerability. Silas didn't win Eleanor by being a wealthy cattle baron. He won her by shedding that title entirely. He gave away his empire to build a school and protect his workers because he finally understood that true wealth is the legacy of kindness we leave behind. Money can buy a secret, and power can buy compliance. But only compassion, equality, and radical, vulnerable love can truly heal a broken soul. Thank you for letting me share this journey with you today. May we all have the courage of Eleanor to stand our ground, and the bravery of Silas to lay down our armor.